The garden was too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that soothes, but the kind that presses against your chest, making it hard to breathe. Margaret Wilson, 68, knelt in the damp soil with her hands wrapped around the stem of a rose bush her husband had planted decades ago. Its blossoms leaned heavy with late autumn rain, crimson petals darkened to the color of dried wine. She tugged at a weed, then stopped, her fingers trembling, staring at the earth as if it had secrets she wasn't ready to face. Behind her, the screen door creaked. Susan's voice carried across the yard, sharp against the soft drizzle. "Mom, you shouldn't be out here in this weather. You'll catch something." Margaret didn't move. She brushed mud from her palm and stood slowly, knees aching. Her daughter, stylish in a cream coat too thin for the season, stepped down the porch steps without looking at the flowers. Susan had Harold's eyes but none of his patience. "You can't keep this place up alone," Susan said, already scanning the peeling paint on the shutters, the sagging gutter. "It's too much for you." The truth in those words cut deep. The house was weary, just as she was. Every corner carried Harold's presence, the smell of his tobacco in the study, the dent in his armchair, the steady warmth he left behind. Without him, the house felt cavernous, almost accusatory. Margaret drew her cardigan tighter and looked at her daughter. Rain traced down Susan's cheekbones like silver threads. "It's not the house I can't manage," she whispered, though she knew Susan wasn't really listening. Susan's smile was practiced, brisk. "Then let's start talking about where you'll go next." And just like that, the first fracture appeared. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee gone cold. Margaret sat at the head of the oak table, the same table where birthdays had been celebrated, arguments whispered, and Harold once carved a turkey with steady hands. Now the wood was bare except for a neat stack of folders Susan slid across, her nails tapping a rhythm that felt impatient rather than nervous. "These are the listings," Susan said, flipping one open. Photographs of sterile condos and trim suburban houses stared up at Margaret. Smaller, safer. Maintenance-free. You wouldn't have to worry about anything. Margaret traced the edge of one photo with her finger. Beige carpet, white walls, a balcony no larger than Harold's old workbench. It looked clean, manageable, utterly soulless. "I'm not ready," she murmured. David's voice broke in from the doorway. He had arrived quietly, carrying the smell of cologne and the smug ease of someone used to taking charge. "No one's ever ready," he said, leaning against the frame. "But it's the smart move. The market's good right now, and you'll thank us later." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Thank us." The phrase lingered, heavy. She glanced at Susan, who was already tucking hair behind her ear, nodding along with her husband's confidence. Outside, the rain had turned to a steady downpour, drumming against the windows. Margaret felt it echo in her chest. Every instinct told her to cling to this house, to the memories woven into its beams and floors. But the way Susan looked at her, half pity, half strategy, made her realize the battle wasn't about the house at all. It was about control. Margaret folded her hands, steady but cold. "I'll think about it," she said. Susan smiled too quickly, relief flooding her face. And in that smile, Margaret saw the trap closing. The apartment smelled like fresh paint, a sterile sweetness that clung to the curtains. Boxes lined the hallway, each one labeled in Susan's neat handwriting. Margaret lowered herself onto the unfamiliar sofa, her hands resting in her lap. She tried to hear Harold's voice in this space, to feel his steady presence. But all she found was silence that hummed too loud. Susan bustled about, opening cabinets, checking the thermostat. "See? Everything's modern. Elevator works perfectly, no stairs to worry about." Her tone was brisk, almost triumphant. Margaret nodded, though her stomach tightened. She had agreed to sell the house, against every instinct, and the ink on the papers was barely dry. When Susan left to take a call, Margaret wandered to the window. City lights shimmered in the drizzle. Then she noticed a photograph left on the counter, half tucked beneath a stack of unopened mail. It was Susan and David, grinning wide, glasses raised in a toast. Behind them stretched a gleaming blue pool. The caption, scrawled in Susan's familiar handwriting, "Finally ours." Margaret's chest clenched. She picked up the photo, her fingers trembling. The apartment was new, yes, but not for her. The kitchen tiles, the balcony view, the luxury pool. These weren't coincidences. This was their dream, bought with the sacrifice of hers. Susan returned, her voice sugar-sweet. "You'll love it here once you settle in." Margaret slipped the photograph into her pocket before Susan could see. She forced a thin smile. "I'm sure I will." But inside, something shifted. The grief that had made her pliable began to harden into something else, something sharp, like glass pressed into the palm. For the first time since Harold's death, Margaret felt awake. Thanksgiving arrived with the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon. Margaret stood at Susan's long dining table, set with polished silverware and candles that burned low. Family chatter filled the air, but underneath it ran a current of tension only she could feel. Susan moved like a hostess in her prime, pouring wine, laughing too brightly. David carved the turkey with exaggerated flourish, slipping jokes between bites of dark meat. To the others, they looked like a golden couple. To Margaret, they looked like actors. Michael, her quiet son, caught her eye from across the table. He raised a brow as if to ask, "Are you all right?" She nodded faintly, though the photograph in her purse felt heavy as stone. Susan leaned close, her hand brushing Margaret's arm. "Mom, I wanted to talk about moving some of your funds," she murmured, her voice low but insistent. "David's investment is time-sensitive. It'll double within the year. It's really for your benefit too." Margaret's fork stilled. Her pulse hammered. Finally ours. The pool, the parties, the lies. Michael spoke up suddenly. "She's already given enough." His tone was calm, but the words cut through the chatter like a knife. The table fell quiet. Susan's smile faltered. "This is between Mom and me," she snapped. Margaret set her fork down gently. Her hands no longer trembled. For weeks she had let grief silence her, had let guilt and love make her pliable. But tonight, with family gathered and lies pressing against her chest, she felt something uncoil. She slid the envelope from her purse, placing it beside her plate. Papers peeked out like teeth. "No," she said, her voice steady, almost calm. "This is between all of us." The room froze. And the feast turned into a stage. The envelope lay in the center of the table like a weapon. Candlelight flickered across the papers inside, the glossy photograph visible on top. Margaret did not move to touch it. She simply looked at Susan, then David, her silence more cutting than any accusation. "What is this?" Michael asked, reaching for the photo. His eyes darkened as he studied it. "Finally ours?" He turned the picture so the whole table could see. Gasps broke the air like glass shattering. Susan's face drained of color. "That's not, Mom, you weren't supposed, not supposed to what?" Margaret's voice carried, firm and clear. "Not supposed to know the truth? That my home, your father's home, was never about me moving somewhere safe. It was about funding your life, your comforts, your pool." David shifted uncomfortably, but his arrogance cracked. "You're twisting this. We wanted what's best for you." Margaret's hand struck the table, sudden and sharp. The glasses rattled. "Don't you dare dress greed as love. I buried my husband in that house. Every corner holds him. And you," she turned to Susan, her daughter who now looked small, cornered, "you sold it for sunlight on water." Tears welled in Susan's eyes, but they came too late. Michael pushed his chair back, disgust etched in every line of his face. "You used her," he said flatly. "Your own mother." The room fell silent, only the hiss of the candles filling the air. Margaret rose slowly, steady despite the weight in her chest. "I may be old," she said, her voice low but unshakable, "but I am not blind. And I am not weak." She gathered the papers, the photograph, her evidence of betrayal, and tucked them under her arm. Then she walked away from the table. And no one dared stop her. The rain had cleared by morning. Margaret stood at the edge of her old front lawn, the grass still damp, the shutters faded but familiar. The house no longer belonged to her, papers had made sure of that, but its presence was unshakable, as though it recognized her still. She didn't knock or try to step inside. Instead, she let her hand rest on the gate, the cool iron grounding her. Behind her, Michael waited in silence. He had insisted on driving, on being there. For once, Margaret did not resist his protectiveness. "You don't have to see them again," Michael said softly. "Not Susan. Not David. You owe them nothing." Margaret's eyes lingered on the windows where she once watched Harold trim the hedges, where Susan once practiced piano. Memory and betrayal lived side by side now, inseparable. But instead of crushing her, the weight steadied her. "I owe myself something," she whispered. She turned away from the house, leaving it behind for the last time, not in shame, not in defeat, but in choice. The papers under her arm were no longer weapons. They were reminders, of what had been stolen, and of what she refused to lose again. Back in Michael's car, the city lights shimmered on the horizon. Margaret felt tired, but it was the clean tiredness of a wound finally cauterized. As they drove off, she looked once more at the shrinking silhouette of the house. A place can be sold, stripped, renamed. But memory, love, and truth, those could not be bought, no matter the price. Margaret closed her eyes, her hand steady in her lap. For the first time since Harold's death, she was not clinging to the past. She was carrying it forward.